Hey, this is Hunter with Lone Star Woodworking, and today I build a desk out of some wood that nobody really seems to like. I have a pretty cool new tool to show you, and I put some bow ties in a project for the first time. So this desk build started with this big kind of ugly slab of wood, and I'm not going to say exactly what it is right now. I had a couple of people guess on TikTok and Instagram, most of which were elm. That's not entirely correct. It is often mistaken for elm, but it's not elm. So about halfway through the video, I'll give you a few facts about it. Until then, just look at it, maybe try to figure it out. Try not to read what it says right there on the slab. But what I ended up trying to do was play around with that template that you saw just a few seconds ago and maybe even try out the single slab desk idea. But this slab had weird contours, so that idea was scrapped pretty quick. And instead, I went with this river table idea. And in order to break it down, I used that new Wen track saw. And Wen is one of those products or one of those brands that is often looked over or disregarded because they're really not that well known for super high quality, super strong tools. But if you're a woodworker that's balling on a budget and you just need tools that are going to get the job done well enough, these are great tools to start with. I actually have their joiner, their drill press, and now their track saw. And I'm very happy with all of them. And plus they're cheap. I got the track saw, the track, which is 100 inches, and the clamps for a little over $200. So there's just a little bit of advice and a tool to maybe check out. So after the slabs were broken down, I got to cleaning them up so that way the epoxy had nothing but nice, good wood to bond to. And then I started building out the form. And I build my forms a little bit differently than most of the epoxy woodworkers recommend. They recommend making it slightly bigger so that way that epoxy has room to shrink and that it's less likely to cause any problems, because it can cause some kind of warping or bowing in it, and that only works with the epoxy. It's actually not the wood. But I don't like to waste epoxy because epoxy is expensive. So I build my forms pretty tight. There's really not any breathing room on the sides. If it does manage to squeeze in there, then, I mean, hey, it is what it is. But I do try to waste as little epoxy as possible. And you can see that it's a pretty tight squeeze for the most part in there. And the resin that I use is not really a household name. It's called Magic Resin. And Matt's Woodworks did a really, really good totally unbiased test on the 13 most used epoxies, and Magic Resin wasn't in there. So unfortunately, there's no test there. But I've been using them for a little over a year now. I've been using their 4-inch formula, and it has worked for me 90% of the time. And that 10% that it hasn't worked has been user error. So if you want a review on them, I'll call them. I'll actually get some information on them so that way you all can have that more affordable option as far as epoxy, because they're a little bit cheaper than most. Epoxy is about $100 to a little bit more per gallon, and Magic Resin is just a little bit cheaper than that. So after the Magic Resin had cured, I'd use some of that tabletop epoxy that you can get from Home Depot, and I blended it together because it was 3 really small 1-quart pours. So I blended it together so that way the black would have a nice uniform color all the way through the river. And that way you just prevent that possibility of the pours not mixing together. And if you watched my last video, you know exactly what happened here. I am just not that good with that form release. I don't know what I'm doing incorrectly. Maybe I'm not using enough, but I think I'm just going to go back to using tape. That one always worked for me, so it is what it is. But after it was busted out of the form and flattened out, I got it all squared up with this track saw again, and you can see here that it leaves a nice clean cut with a really, really small sliver, which was really impressive. From there, I started sanding out all of these lines so that I could inlay my C-channels. Now again, there's a million videos on how to do this, so instead I'm going to go ahead and give you those little facts that I told you about this slab. So it smells absolutely awful. It has some of the worst smell from wood that I've ever smelled. It is a hardwood. It has a Jonker rating of about 880 pounds. It is indigenous to the southern United States, is anatomically similar to elm, but is often mistaken for ash. So those are the only facts I'm giving you, and now you just have to try to guess looking at the slab for the rest of the video, and then I'll reveal it at the very end. All right, so after I had inlaid everything I needed to for the C channels, I went to work on finishing up all the sanding for the bottom. And I may not have had to fix all of these little imperfections on the bottom. You're not ever really going to see them, but it makes me feel better as the maker knowing that whoever the client may be, because this hasn't been bought yet, it's just something I made for fun. Whoever the client may be, they're going to be getting a quality product even in the spots that they shouldn't have to worry about. And here I'm just kind of showing the difference between some of the regular 5-hole sandpaper that my rigid sander is specifically designed for and the mesh sandpaper. And this is only a single grit difference. So the 5-hole sandpaper that I was using is at 40 and this is at 60 with the mesh. And the difference is pretty big. Like the pattern that the mesh sandpaper leaves is a lot cleaner and leaves a much nicer finish and texture to the wood. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this mesh sandpaper going forward, and I actually bought a brand new sander to specifically use this mesh sandpaper as efficiently as it is meant to be used. And at the higher grits, the sandpaper can kind of gunk up, so you just need this eraser tool and it cleans it up, makes it work like new. While it was still upside down, I went ahead and sanded the chamfer, and you got to be really careful here. I think I only went to 180. I don't think that I used any lower grit because I really didn't want to mess up the proportions to that 90-degree edge and that 22-degree edge. After I was satisfied with all of the fixes and the sanding texture on the bottom, I went ahead and started on the top and going at it with 40 grit here, just really knocking down all those high spots and getting all of these really small micro imperfections fixed. And after I think I got to 100 grit, I started cutting out these bow ties. And no, before you start saying like, oh, you know, he did a really good job. Well, I didn't cut these out by hand. These are done with a router jig that I got from Slab Stitcher. This is their medium slim line, and I really like the look of these. I don't know if I have any interest in cutting out my own bow ties. It's just not something that I ever really truly considered. I'm extremely impressed with people that can do that. But tools are meant to make our lives easier, so why try to make things harder on ourselves just for the sake of saying that, you know, we do things the hard way. But here you can see that the inlays are extremely accurate. Here I think I messed up. I don't think I put the jig on tight enough, so it actually shifted a little bit, creating that gap. But with some wood glue and wood dust, it disappeared, and this is the end result. And this is me water popping it. And it's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. All right, from there, I just started to put some water on all of these little spots with the resin because those cracks are notorious for having little spots that you can't see unless the resin is nice and clear, if that makes sense. So you got to wipe water on it or finish on it before you actually see the imperfection. From there, I put the 1/8 inch round over on the table and started sanding it all the way up to 320. And here's a pretty good idea of what it looks like. And I started getting pretty excited here. It's a lot nicer looking than I expected it to be. So this is after sanding it at 320. I have my inspection light and I'm doing my last little detailed check over it just to make sure everything is nice and consistent. I probably could have and should have gotten those sander lines out, but it was a consistent texture all the way through. All right, so the finish that I'm using is Rubio Monocoat. The reason I'm using Rubio is because it is the best, hard wax finish that you can have on there. I'm in a garage, so everything is dusty, and this finish is able to be applied in a dusty shop because it's buff on, buff off. So even if there are flakes and dirt dust nibs all over the place, you can still get a perfect finish. And plus, I'd be lying if I said that using the buffer wasn't a whole lot of fun. So after I finish the bottom, I immediately wipe it off and go to work on finishing the top, because you don't want the bottom side or the top side of that slab to be absorbing moisture from the air while the other side is sealed with that finish. And this may not be the proper application of this buffer, but it's light enough to where I can do that and delicate enough to where it's not going to mess anything up. And here you can see that this wood is really, really pretty, and I was very happy with the way this came out. And then I messed up by trying to be, I guess, better than, the first coat of finish. Because then after I wiped it off, and you'll see here that the sheen is absolutely perfect. Like, I probably could not have done better if I tried. But I did try. I ended up sanding it with 800 grit with some sandpaper that is not all that great. You can see there in the river that the texture is kind of crappy. So after I got it all wiped off, you can see here that there are certain spots where I gouged it. The sandpaper clogged up really, really bad and left some really bad pigtails. So even though the pictures that you'll see here in a little bit turned out really nice and the overall look of the desk is really not that bad, I'm going to be refinishing this thing because I know that it can be better than that. But after it was finished and after I was somewhat satisfied with it, I went ahead and put on these legs by Flowy Line Design. I really, really like his contemporary style, and these legs fit really well with the table. And what I'm super proud of, and what I think I learned the most from in my last video, is how to take really good pictures. My wife has instructed me on how to take some better pictures because she has more experience with that. So I bought a black backdrop, and I did an okay job with the redwood table. But with this, I think I did a really, really good job, and I think it's only going to get better from here. Okay, so this wood is called hackberry. It's a wood that is usually thrown away or used in like these really hidden away construction projects, but is incredibly beautiful if you can find the right one. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time. See ya.